In the final months of 1945, along the edges of a forest road in western Germany, 13-year-old Oscar moved through these snowbanks under guard, his boots slipping on frozen mud as American soldiers led a small group of captured German auxiliaries out of the woods. Hours earlier, he had been pressed into the last desperate defense of a crumbling line, carrying a rifle far too large for his height and wearing a uniform that hung loosely around his shoulders. The collapse came quickly when American tanks entered the clearing, scattering the last defenders. Oscar dropped his rifle as soon as the order to surrender was shouted, raising his hands while the cold air stung his face. The Americans processed the group with brisk efficiency, separating those who appeared too young to have served officially. Oscar was moved to the side with several others who looked more like displaced boys than soldiers. They were placed onto a transport truck and driven toward a temporary holding area outside a nearby town. The road wound through farmland and ruined villages where smoke still drifted from bombed roofs. Oscar kept his eyes lowered, holding his thin coat closed against the wind. He felt the weight of his capture settle on him, not with fear of the Americans themselves, but with uncertainty about what awaited him as a prisoner. The truck eventually halted outside a fenced compound, set up on an open field. American guards led the prisoners through a gate and toward a row of makeshift barracks. The camp was functional rather than hostile, with tents arranged in straight lines and paths cleared through the snow. Inside the barracks, Oscar was given a place on a wooden platform covered with a thin blanket. The cold seeped into the structure even during the day, but it offered protection from the wind. He sat quietly, observing the other boys who had been captured. Some stared at the floor, others glanced around nervously, and a few sat rigidly as though awaiting judgment. Rumors spread quickly among the prisoners. Some believed summary punishment was coming for anyone who had been armed, regardless of age. Others claimed child soldiers would be separated for questioning about their training. But before we continue, if you want to hear more incredible and untold stories from history, make sure to like the video and hit the subscribe button, and tell me in the comments what country you're watching from, and share any stories you or your relatives have from World War II. I would love to read them as well. Alright. Oscar listened without adding to the conversation, aware that none of them knew anything for certain. He had been told before surrender that capture by Americans meant harsh treatment or death, though those warnings now seemed shaped more by fear and propaganda than by reality. Still, when a guard instructed them to line up outside the following morning, the tension in the group rose sharply. Oscar joined the line, his breath forming faint clouds in the cold air. The guards guided them toward the far side of the compound, where a small clearing had been marked off. The ground there was stamped flat by repeated activity, bordered by snow on every side. The boys exchanged unsure glances. Oscar kept his head low and followed the line forward, bracing for whatever awaited them. The clearing contained no equipment that clearly indicated purpose, only a rough wooden table and a row of crates pushed against a fence. The lack of clarity intensified the anxiety among the prisoners, who had heard stories of executions carried out without ceremony during earlier phases of the war. Oscar's pulse quickened as he stepped into the open area. The guard motioned for the boys to stand in a straight line facing forward. Some obeyed stiffly, others hesitated but complied. Oscar took his place in the middle of the line, tightening his fingers into fists inside his gloves. American officers stood off to the side, reviewing paperwork. They spoke briefly with guards, pointing occasionally toward the line of children. Oscar interpreted each gesture as potential confirmation of the worst possibility. His mind worked through the limited information he understood. He had been found with a weapon, captured wearing a uniform, and identified as part of a military structure that had collapsed under the final pressure of the war. He knew he had no agency in how he had been placed there, but he doubted such distinctions would matter if retribution guided the decisions of those now in control. The guards instructed the boys to remain still. Several minutes passed as the officers completed their review. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the sound of wind sweeping across the field and the low thud of distant artillery from another sector. Oscar stood rigidly, convinced that punishment could come without warning. The stories told to him and others in the closing months of the war had emphasized merciless consequences if captured by Allied forces. Although those claims lacked evidence, they had been repeated often enough to create a lasting impression. When one of the officers approached, the tension in the line reached its peak. The officer's expression was unreadable, cold from the morning chill, rather than from hostility. He reviewed the faces of the boys before turning to speak with the guards. Oscar heard none of the words, but the steady, procedurial tone contrasted sharply with the dread that had gathered within him. The guards nodded, adjusting their positions slightly, and stepped aside. Oscar braced himself. Instead of rifles or commands signaling execution, a group of American support personnel arrived from the far side of the clearing, carrying wooden crates. The crates were placed on the table, and the officers made brief notes on their clipboards. One of the crates was opened, revealing rows of dark glass bottles packed in straw. Another crate contained paper-wrapped bundles. The support personnel arranged the contents neatly while the boys watched in confusion. Oscar stared, unsure what he was seeing. The guards stepped aside, allowing the workers space to operate. The scene contradicted every rumor that had circulated in the barracks the night before. There was no preparation for a firing squad. Instead, the Americans seemed to be setting up something that resembled a distribution point, not a place of punishment. The officer who had inspected the line returned and spoke calmly to one of the guards. The guard nodded and approached the boys. Instead of delivering any harsh order, he motioned them to step forward, one at a time. The boys hesitated at first, uncertain whether this was a procedure preceding something worse. But when one boy moved forward and received a bottle from the crate, confusion replaced fear. The guard gestured again, encouraging the next to approach. Oscar stepped forward when his turn arrived. A worker lifted a bottle from the crate and placed it carefully in his hands. The glass was cool, and inside the dark liquid bubbled faintly. Oscar recognized the label only from distant stories about life in America, though he had never seen such a drink in person. The worker also gave him a small paper-wrapped bundle containing a piece of soft bread and a slice of pressed meat. Oscar accepted the items hesitantly, still trying to comprehend the purpose of the gathering. The other boys received similar items and stepped away from the table to gather in small groups. The atmosphere gradually shifted from dread to cautious relief. Oscar examined the bottle, turning it in his hands. He had not expected anything like this. The officer who had earlier inspected the line watched the distribution with a neutral but steady expression, as though ensuring the process remained orderly. Oscar finally placed his thumb under the metal cap of the bottle and managed to pry it open. The carbonation hissed softly, releasing a scent that was unfamiliar but not unpleasant. He took a small sip. The sweetness was unlike anything he had tasted before. The chilled liquid carried a sharp fizz that filled his mouth, and for a brief moment, he felt removed from the cold field, the ruined villages, and the remnants of battle surrounding the camp. Nearby, other boys reacted similarly, surprised by the taste and unsure how to process their sudden shift in circumstances. The guards maintained their distance, allowing the prisoners to sit on the snow-dusted ground while drinking slowly. The contrast between the expectations of the morning and the reality that unfolded created a sense of disorientation that persisted even after the initial surprise faded. The distribution continued until every boy received food and a bottle. Only then did the officer address the guards, instructing them to guide the group toward a long wooden table placed near the barracks. The table held stacks of blankets, clean clothing, and identification tags. The Americans began to assign each boy new items, marking them as non-combatant detainees rather than prisoners facing punishment. Oscar followed the line, receiving a blanket thicker than the one he had been issued earlier. The guard placed it over his shoulders and directed him toward another table where a medic checked his temperature and recorded his name. The process was orderly, efficient, and impersonal, but it lacked any sense of hostility. It became apparent that the boys had been gathered not for execution but for reclassification. The Americans intended to separate minors from the main prisoner population and ensure that they received warmer clothing and better supervision during the harsh winter. Oscar moved through the stations quietly, absorbing each step with a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief. The camp had shifted its approach rapidly as the Americans gained control of more territory and encountered increasing numbers of underage conscripts. The policies governing the treatment of minors had changed, emphasizing care rather than punishment. Oscar and many others were now part of this adjusted process. When he finished the final station, Oscar returned to the barracks wrapped in his new blanket. The snow outside had begun to fall more heavily, removing the clear outlines of footprints and softening the boundaries of the camp. The earlier tension had dissipated completely, replaced by murmurs among the boys about the unexpected turn of events. Oscar remained silent while reflecting on how close he had come to believing the worst. He sat on his platform bed, holding the empty Coca-Cola bottle in his hands. The label was partially worn from moisture, but the shape and feel of the glass became a small anchor in a world that had until then offered only uncertainty. The snow continued falling for several days after Oscar and the other boys were reclassified, covering the camp in a thick layer that softened the appearance of tents, fences, and equipment. The cold persisted, but the Americans began rotating additional supplies into the area, bringing heavier coats, wool hats, and medical kits that made the winter more manageable for the miners. Oscar found himself assigned to a separate barracks with boys his age, all of whom were given light duties such as carrying firewood, clearing pathways, or helping distribute blankets at scheduled intervals. The work kept them occupied without placing them under strain. The camp environment, though still governed by strict routines, shifted into a calmer rhythm as the front lines moved farther east. The rumble of artillery grew distant, and the American units stationed near the camp focused more on administrative tasks and maintaining order among the growing number of prisoners. For Oscar, the change in atmosphere allowed space for reflection. The fear that had dominated the first days of his captivity gradually receded, replaced by the quiet routines of daily life in the barracks. Oscar adjusted slowly. He ate regularly for the first time in months, slept through the night without fear of sudden evacuation, and learned to navigate the predictable structure of the camp's schedule. The Americans maintained clear expectations for hygiene, meals, and inspections, which gave the boys a sense of stability that had been absent during the chaotic final months of the war. The guards, though firm, treated the boys with a form of detached fairness, ensuring they received the provisions required to endure the winter. Occasionally, trucks arrived carrying more crates of supplies, including additional bottles of Coca-Cola. These deliveries became moments that stood out against the monotony of camp life. The drink was served in moderation, usually during special distributions meant to maintain morale among the miners. Oscar accepted it each time with the same quiet astonishment he had felt on that first morning in the clearing. The cold fizz, the unfamiliar flavor, and the simple novelty of holding something so distinctly foreign created a contrast that remained vivid in his memory. As weeks became months, Oscar grew accustomed to the idea that the war was ending. Rumors of surrender circulated among the prisoners long before any official announcement reached them. When confirmation finally came, it arrived with little ceremony but with clear implications. Processing for repatriation began soon afterward, and Oscar's group was placed on a list for eventual return to civilian authorities once transportation was arranged. The day he left the camp, Oscar carried only a small bundle containing the blanket he had been given and a few personal items. Among them was the empty Coca-Cola bottle from that first morning. The guards allowed him to keep it, understanding it held no value beyond personal meaning. Oscar tucked it carefully into his bundle before boarding the transport truck. As the vehicle moved away from the camp, he watched the rows of tents recede into the snowy landscape, recognizing that the place where he had once anticipated death had instead become the first environment in months where structure and safety existed. In the years that followed, as he returned to a country rebuilding itself from ruins, Oscar rarely spoke about the war. The memories remained, but he chose not to describe the fear he had carried during the collapse of the front or the confusion that had surrounded his capture. Yet the moment in the clearing when he had braced for the worst and received something entirely different stayed with him. The bottle, preserved carefully among his belongings, served as a quiet reminder that the world could shift in unexpected ways. It was not the sweetness of the drink that made the memory endure, nor the novelty of encountering something from a distant culture. What remained with him was the realization that compassion, even when offered in simple form, could dismantle the dread that war had built within him. The Americans had chosen not to treat the boys as condemned enemies but as children caught in circumstances beyond their control. Oscar understood the significance of that decision long before he could articulate it. As he grew older, the bottle remained tucked away in a small box, carried with him through each relocation and transition. It represented the moment when fear gave way to relief, when survival replaced expectation of death, and when the world beyond conflict revealed itself briefly through the cold, fizzy taste of a drink he had never imagined tasting. And so the memory stayed quiet, steady, and unembellished, anchored in that snowy clearing where a line of frightened boys stood waiting for judgment and instead received something unexpectedly human.